Jonathan Roumie stood in the first-class line, dressed simply, a stark contrast to the luxury around him. A man watched him with disdain, unable to hide his arrogance. What happened next would leave everyone on that plane completely speechless and forever change one life. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another special story for you. The Seattle-Tacoma International Airport was as busy as always. People coming and going, conversations blending together, and luggage rolling in all directions. In the middle of it all, Jonathan Roumie stood calmly in the first-class line. He wore a faded plaid shirt, worn-out jeans, and scuffed boots, with a backpack that looked like it had traveled the world with him. There was nothing flashy about him, and perhaps because of that, he went unnoticed. Yet anyone who took a closer look could sense something different. It wasn't just the way he dressed, but the calmness he exuded. He seemed like someone who didn't let the chaos around him affect his peace, while everyone else appeared rushed and anxious. Jonathan stood there, tranquil, observing everything as if soaking in the moment. He didn't mind the glances or the stark contrast between himself and the other passengers. Right behind him in the line was Richard Grayson. Richard was the complete opposite of Jonathan. He wore an expensive suit, polished shoes, and a cologne that demanded attention. Every movement he made seemed rehearsed, as though he wanted the world to know he was someone important. His eyes quickly scanned the line, and when they landed on Jonathan, he couldn't hold back his comment. First class. Huh, Richard said with an ironic smile. You never know who might show up here these days. Jonathan turned his head and looked at him, keeping his expression calm. Yeah, he replied. The world is full of surprises. Richard frowned for a moment. He seemed to expect a bigger reaction, something that would confirm what he thought about the man in front of him. But Jonathan stayed quiet, as if the comment didn't matter. Richard decided to push further. Look, nothing personal, he said, chuckling softly. But you don't seem like the type who flies like this. It's rare to see someone so casual in first class. The moment to board had arrived. The first-class line began moving forward, and Jonathan and Richard, without exchanging any more words, followed with their tickets in hand. Richard, as usual, walked with firm, confident strides, while Jonathan seemed oblivious to the commotion around him, walking at the same calm pace as before. When they finally entered the plane, the unexpected happened. Upon reaching his seat, Richard checked his ticket once more, and as he looked up, he saw Jonathan settling into the seat right next to his. You've got to be kidding me, Richard muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. He sat down beside Jonathan and let out a low chuckle, as if the situation was a joke. Of all the places possible, it had to be here. Jonathan simply looked at him with that same calm demeanor and gave a slight smile. Looks like we're traveling together then, he said politely. Richard crossed his arms, trying to hide his discomfort. It wasn't just the fact that he was sitting next to Jonathan, but the thought that the man he had judged minutes ago was now sharing the same exclusive space as him. He couldn't quite explain why, but Jonathan's presence unsettled him in a way he couldn't ignore. As the economy class passengers finished boarding, Richard decided to strike up a conversation, but not in a friendly way. So, what do you do for a living? He asked with the casual tone of someone who already thought they knew the answer but wanted confirmation. Jonathan, who was adjusting his backpack under the seat in front of him, looked up and answered simply, I work in film. Richard raised his eyebrows, as if surprised. Oh, I see. Commercials, small-time stuff. Jonathan gave a slight smile and shook his head. Something like that. Richard laughed. I've always found it interesting how people try to find their place. You know, but sometimes, certain spaces just aren't meant for everyone. Like first class. For instance. Jonathan looked at him for a moment, assessing the situation, but maintained his calm demeanor. I think we all have our place, he replied, and sometimes it's exactly where we are. Richard let out a short laugh. That's nice. Kind of philosophical even. But real life isn't that simple. Jonathan didn't respond immediately. He just turned back to the window, as if the conversation was over. But Richard wasn't done yet. You know what? He said, leaning slightly toward him. You might be sitting here, but there are things money can't buy. Some places will never really belong to certain people. This time, Jonathan didn't respond with words. He simply looked at him for a moment with an expression that combined patience and a certain firmness. It was the kind of look that said more than any words ever could. Richard, realizing his provocation hadn't had the desired effect, leaned back into his seat with a satisfied smile. He thought he had the upper hand in the situation. But the truth was, things were only just beginning. Richard was convinced he was in control, but Jonathan's calmness hid something he couldn't foresee. With every passing minute, what seemed like a simple conversation was turning into something much bigger. As the plane took off, the in-flight service began. A flight attendant named Emily moved through first class, offering drinks. Richard made sure to be noticed. A glass of champagne, please, he said with a confident smile, something that matches the exclusivity of this seat. Emily, accustomed to demanding passengers, nodded with a professional smile. When it was Jonathan's turn, he made a simple request. Just water. Please. Richard didn't miss the opportunity to comment. He looked at Jonathan with that same air of superiority and let out a chuckle. Water, he asked, almost laughing. Don't tell me you're going to waste the experience of flying first class with water. Jonathan took the bottle Emily handed him and replied calmly, I'm fine with this. Sometimes simplicity is enough. Richard narrowed his eyes, as if trying to decipher the answer, but quickly decided to push back. Yeah, I guess that works for people who settle for less. Not everyone is born to enjoy the best life has to offer. Jonathan raised the bottle and took a small sip, not responding immediately. Other passengers began to notice Richard's provocative tone, but since Jonathan appeared unbothered, no one intervened. Maybe the best is different for everyone. Jonathan finally said, with the same calmness as always. Richard didn't like the answer. He took a deep breath, trying to maintain control of the conversation. Or maybe, he said, his voice sharper. People who say that just never had access to what really matters. Some things are beyond the reach of certain people. You know, Emily, who was serving another passenger, cast a discreet glance in their direction, as if considering stepping in. But she noticed Jonathan was handling the situation well. He responded with nothing more than a slight smile, turning back to look out the window. Richard, on the other hand, didn't seem satisfied. He wanted to provoke more, but he was beginning to realize that Jonathan was a difficult opponent to rattle. Richard was convinced he was winning the dispute, but for the passengers around them, his arrogance was becoming increasingly uncomfortable, while Jonathan remained calm, setting the stage for a reality that would completely change Richard's views on people. The plane had settled into its cruising altitude, the soft light from the window casting a gentle glow on Jonathan Roumie's calm face. Richard Grayson, though still projecting confidence, felt a growing unease gnawing at him. His provocations seemed to slide off Jonathan, and that only fueled Richard's desire to push the confrontation further. He took a sip of his champagne, his eyes darting from Jonathan to the other passengers, as if to reaffirm his dominance. But the atmosphere in first class had shifted. A few passengers began casting glances at Richard, their expressions a mix of curiosity and disapproval. Jonathan, meanwhile, sat quietly, holding his water bottle, his gaze fixed on the sky outside, as if lost in thoughts far deeper than the jabs from the man beside him. Richard couldn't stand the silence. He leaned toward Jonathan, his voice low but sharper now. "You know," he said, his smirk returning, "I've worked my whole life to sit here. People like you, with that odd look, think they can just waltz into places they don't belong. Where are you even from to think you deserve this seat?" His words carried a new edge, not just arrogance, but a hint of prejudice, emphasizing odd as if Jonathan's appearance or demeanor didn't fit the mold of what Richard deemed a first-class American. Jonathan turned to him, his eyes still calm but now with a sharper glint. "I was born and raised in the States, if that's what you're asking," he replied evenly, his tone steady enough to make Richard pause. "As for deserving, I don't think that's about how someone dresses or where they come from." Jonathan's words were gentle but piercing, striking without raising his voice. A passenger in front, a middle-aged woman named Margaret, gave a subtle nod, as if approving of Jonathan's response. Richard caught her glance, and it only deepened his irritation. But Richard didn't back down. He let out a forced laugh, trying to regain his footing. "Oh, don't get me wrong. I'm just saying some people don't look like they belong here. First class is for those who've sweated for success, not for anyone who just got lucky." His words now dripped with clear bias, implying Jonathan was an outsider, despite knowing nothing about him beyond his casual attire. A few nearby passengers began to whisper, their looks shifting from curiosity to discomfort. An older man named Charles, seated a few rows away, shook his head, clearly unimpressed with Richard's attitude. Jonathan didn't respond immediately. He set his water bottle on the tray, meeting Richard's gaze. "I hear you," he said, his voice steady but carrying an undeniable weight. "But I think success isn't something you need to shout about to prove. It's in how you treat others, not where you're from or how you look." His words landed like a quiet thunderclap, rippling through the cabin. The first-class section fell into a tense silence, broken only by the hum of the engines. A few passengers nodded subtly, their eyes now fixed disapprovingly on Richard. Richard felt the shift but clung to his defiant air. "Cheap philosophy," he muttered, his voice betraying a slight tremor. "Sounds nice, but the real world doesn't work that way." Jonathan offered a faint smile, unshaken. "Maybe," he said, "but the real world is made by people. And how we treat each other says more about who we are than anything else." His words hung in the air, resonating with those around them. A young passenger named Michael, seated behind, whispered to his companion, "This guy's got a point." Richard sensed the growing scrutiny from others, his confident facade starting to crack. He crossed his arms, trying to mask his unease. But his smug smile had faded. Suddenly, a voice cut through from the back of the cabin. "Gentlemen, please keep it down a bit," said Emily, the flight attendant, her tone professional but laced with a warning. She'd been watching the exchange and sensed it was escalating. Richard shrugged, forcing a grin. "No big deal. Miss, just a friendly chat." But Emily didn't smile back. She glanced at Jonathan, her eyes checking if he needed her to step in. Jonathan gave a subtle shake of his head, signaling he was fine. Emily nodded and moved on, but the tension in the cabin remained thick. Richard, feeling his grip on the situation slipping, decided to throw another jab. He leaned closer, his voice turning venomous. "You talk about respect, But let's be real. People like you, with that out-of-place vibe, always spout these empty platitudes to cover up having nothing to show for. You have any idea what I've done to sit here? I doubt you'd get it. His words were no longer just arrogant, they were outright offensive, painting Jonathan as someone unworthy because of his appearance or perceived background. Jonathan met Richard's gaze, his expression no longer just patient, but tinged with resolve. "I don't know your story, Richard," he said, his voice low but firm. "But I've met plenty of people who think they need to put others down to prove something. That doesn't make you bigger. It just shows you're afraid of something." His words cut like a blade, slicing through Richard's bravado. Richard opened his mouth to retort, but found himself at a loss for words. The cabin was quiet, the hum of the plane underscoring the weight of Jonathan's response. A few passengers exchanged glances, some visibly impressed by Jonathan's calm yet sharp comeback. Richard's face flushed, unaccustomed to being challenged so publicly. He wasn't used to this, especially not in front of an audience. He took another sip of champagne, his hand trembling slightly. Afraid he repeated, forcing a laugh. "You don't know a thing about me. I built everything from nothing. People like you wouldn't understand." Jonathan didn't respond right away. He studied Richard, as if seeing something deeper in his eyes. "Maybe you're right," Jonathan said. "I don't know your story, but I know that when someone keeps shouting about what they've got, it's usually because they're hiding something. Fear, loneliness, or just an empty feeling inside." Jonathan's words hit like a sledgehammer. Richard froze, his eyes flickering to the wedding band on his finger, which he twisted absent-mindedly. A young woman named Sarah, seated nearby, gave a small smile, clearly struck by Jonathan's quiet wisdom. Richard caught her look, and it only heightened his discomfort. He wanted to fire back, to regain control, but each of Jonathan's words seemed to peel back the layers of his arrogance in front of everyone. Just then, Emily returned with a fresh tray of drinks. She paused by Jonathan, her voice soft but clear enough for the cabin to hear. "Mr. Roumie," she said, "the captain asked me to inform you that your connection in Chicago is confirmed. He also sends his best regards." The name Roumie echoed through first class like a bell. A few passengers widened their eyes, murmurs spreading. Richard froze, his face paling. "Roumie," he muttered, almost inaudibly. "Jonathan Roumie." Jonathan nodded politely to Emily, thanking her with a smile, seemingly oblivious to the stir his name caused. He turned to Richard, who now stared at him as if he'd seen a ghost. "Something wrong?" Richard Jonathan asked, his voice still calm but with a hint of playfulness. Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. He glanced around, noticing the other passengers' eyes on him, some shaking their heads, others whispering. His once proud demeanor crumbled, replaced by a raw, unmistakable embarrassment. The first-class cabin was thick with tension, the murmurs of passengers filling the air like static. Richard Grayson sank deeper into his seat, his face a mix of shock and humiliation. The name Jonathan Roumie still echoed in his mind, unraveling the arrogance he'd worn like armor. He'd spent the flight belittling a man he assumed was beneath him, only to learn he was sitting next to a renowned actor, a figure admired for both his talent and humility. Jonathan, meanwhile, remained composed, his eyes scanning a book he'd pulled from his backpack, as if the revelation of his identity hadn't changed a thing. The other passengers' whispers grew louder, their glances now openly judgmental toward Richard. He felt their eyes like a spotlight, exposing every word he'd said. Richard tried to regain his composure, his fingers fidgeting with his empty champagne glass. I I had no idea, he stammered, his voice low, almost pleading. I mean, you didn't say who you were. Jonathan closed his book gently, turning to face him. I didn't think I needed to, he said, his tone steady but firm. My name doesn't change what you said. Richard. It's not about who I am. It's about how you chose to treat someone you thought was less than you. His words cut through the cabin, quiet but heavy, drawing nods from passengers like Margaret and Charles, who'd been watching the exchange unfold. Richard's face reddened further. He glanced around, hoping to find an ally, but the other passengers' expressions ranged from disapproval to outright disdain. Sarah, the young woman nearby, shook her head slightly, her earlier smile replaced by a look of disappointment. Richard's bravado was gone, replaced by a sinking realization that his words, tinged with arrogance and prejudice, had painted him as the outsider in this space. He tried to salvage the moment. Look, I didn't mean to offend you, he said, his voice cracking. I didn't know I was talking to Jonathan Roumie. Jonathan leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. It shouldn't matter who I am. Richard, he said, you don't get a pass for putting someone down just because you didn't know their name. Respect isn't about status, it's about character. The cabin seemed to hold its breath, the weight of Jonathan's words settling over everyone. Richard opened his mouth to respond, but closed it again, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. He sank back, staring at his hands. The wedding band he'd been twisting now a reminder of the emptiness Jonathan had called out. The flight attendant, Emily, returned, sensing the shift in the cabin. She addressed the passengers with a professional smile but kept her eyes on Richard. Is everything all right here? She asked. Her tone polite but pointed. Jonathan nodded calmly, but Richard only mumbled. Fine. Emily lingered for a moment, her gaze assessing, before moving on. The other passengers, however, weren't so quick to let it go. Charles, the older man, leaned toward his seatmate and whispered, "That guy's dug his own grave." The comment wasn't meant for Richard to hear, but it reached him, stinging like salt in a wound. As the flight continued, Richard's discomfort grew unbearable. He couldn't shake Jonathan's words or the passengers' stares. He'd always prided himself on being in control, the one who commanded respect. But now he felt exposed, his flaws laid bare. Jonathan, on the other hand, seemed unaffected, flipping through his book with the same tranquility he'd carried since boarding. The contrast only deepened Richard's shame. He wanted to say something, anything, to claw back his dignity, but every attempt felt hollow. Finally, he turned to Jonathan, his voice barely above a whisper. I was wrong. Okay, I shouldn't have said those things. Not just because of who you are, but because it was wrong. Jonathan looked at him, his expression softening but still resolute. I appreciate that, he said. But an apology isn't just words. Richard, it's about what you do next. You don't have to prove anything to me or anyone else, but you might want to think about what you're proving to yourself. Richard nodded slowly, the words sinking in. For the first time, he felt the weight of his own actions, not just in this moment but in countless others, where he'd judged people based on appearances or assumptions. The plane began its descent into Chicago, the captain's voice crackling over the intercom with landing instructions. As the cabin prepared for arrival, an unexpected announcement followed. Ladies and gentlemen, Emily's voice came through. We'd like to remind all passengers to treat each other with respect. Any behavior deemed disruptive or discriminatory may result in consequences upon landing, including denial of future travel privileges with our airline. The message was general, but Richard felt it like a personal rebuke. His heart sank as he caught Emily's glance, her professional smile now carrying a hint of warning. When the plane touched down, the passengers began to gather their belongings. Jonathan packed his book into his backpack, moving with the same unhurried grace he'd shown throughout. Richard, however, sat frozen, his hands gripping the armrests. As the cabin emptied, Emily approached him, her expression neutral but firm. "Mr. Grayson," she said, "the captain would like a word with you before you disembark." Richard's stomach dropped. He glanced at Jonathan, who gave him a small, almost sympathetic nod before heading toward the exit. On the jetway, a small crowd had gathered fans who'd recognized Jonathan during the flight. They approached him respectfully, asking for photos or a quick word. Jonathan greeted each one with warmth, his smile genuine, his demeanor humble. Richard watched from a distance, escorted by Emily to meet the captain. The meeting was brief but devastating. The captain, a stern man named Captain Harris, informed Richard that his behavior had been reported by multiple passengers and crew. "Your comments were not only rude, but crossed into discriminatory territory," Harris said. "Our airline has a zero-tolerance policy for this. You're banned from flying with us for 6 months, and we'll be notifying our partner airlines." Richard's face drained of color. He tried to protest, citing his status as a frequent flyer, but Harris cut him off. "Status doesn't excuse disrespect. Mr. Grayson, you might want to reflect on that." As Richard exited the jetway, he saw Jonathan in the terminal, still surrounded by fans. Jonathan's kindness stood in stark contrast to the reprimand Richard had just received. He felt a pang of regret, not just for the ban, but for the realization that his actions had cost him more than a flight. A business associate, waiting to meet Richard for a critical deal in Chicago, overheard the exchange and quietly slipped away, unwilling to align with someone whose behavior had drawn such scrutiny. Richard stood alone in the terminal, watching Jonathan disappear into the crowd. Jonathan's words echoed in his mind. "It's about what you do next." For the first time, Richard questioned the man he'd become, the one who measured worth by wealth and status, who used prejudice to feel superior. He clutched his suitcase, the weight of his choices heavier than ever. Jonathan, meanwhile, walked on, unaware of the ripple effect he'd caused. His simple presence had exposed Richard's flaws and sparked a chance for change if Richard chose to take it. In that moment, the lesson was clear: true worth isn't in what you have or where you sit, but in how you treat others. Richard's punishment wasn't just a ban or a lost deal, it was the mirror held up to his own heart, forcing him to see the cost of his arrogance. As Jonathan faded into the airport crowd, Richard knew this encounter would stay with him, a chance to rethink his path and become someone better. Thank you for following this story. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. If you'd like more inspiring stories about justice and resilience, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We'll be back tomorrow with another must-see story you won't want to miss.